Thank you. Okay. Am I sound good? Awesome. I'm going to try to keep you awake while you're digesting your lunch. The Civil War remains one of the most written about and studied events in American history, and yet historians continue to make new discoveries, prompting new insight into the war. And that was the case for me when, in my position as a curator at the Bessbauer Dunn Museum, I set out to identify the men in this portrait, initially simply just to add their names to the museum database. So it was, part of the job. But once I solved that mystery, I realized there was so much more I wanted to know about them. And it wasn't a project I could complete on work time. So I had to take this days off, vacation, weekends, you know the routine. The journey took me 7 years, and it led me on a hunt for any clues to these men's lives that I could locate in the collections of archives and historical societies throughout Illinois and beyond. And it actually took me to meeting some of the men's descendants, so that was very exciting. The portrait was taken at Camp Fuller in Rockford, Illinois in the second year of the Civil War, and it commemorated the men's bonds and their shared commitment to the preservation of the United States. The result of my research is a collective biography and the first extensive look at the service of the 96th Illinois since the regiment published its history in 1887. There I am. So this is the photo tintype that sparked my research. It was donated to the Dunn Museum in 1962 during the Civil War centennial celebrations that were going on all over the United States. At that time, the donor was only able to identify his grandfather, Scottish-born Edward Murray, who had enlisted from Lake County in the 96th Illinois. Murray is pictured at the bottom right in the portrait. That's me in the archives there. I just wanted to give you a sense of the size of it as well. So this little thing that had me completely enraptured. Within the span of just 2 generations, the connection between the donor's grandfather and the other men in the portrait was lost. The donor didn't know who those men were. I still remember the day that photo tintype came off exhibit at the museum, and I realized that only one of the men was identified. And not knowing their names was hugely disappointing. I felt compelled to recover their identities because without their names, their contributions in the Civil War were lost. Knowing that Edward Murray was born in Scotland and that the 96th Illinois had a majority of American-born enlistees, I assumed that some of the men in this portrait were also American. I did not anticipate that they were all immigrants from Britain and Ireland. That seemed very unusual to me. This key discovery places the portrait in a different context. The portrait is evidence that immigrants wholeheartedly responded to the call to arms, and it offers a new perspective on who was enlisting in the Union Army. The first source you have to go to is a regimental history if you have it available. So that's what I did. I just went back to my office and grabbed the regimental history off the shelf in hopes of being able to identify the men. And you can see from the pages here, a lot of each company had its own chapter, and a lot of the men or their families sent photos in to be included in the history. So I used that for comparison to the group portrait. But there were a couple of them that were a little bit more tricky to identify and took a little longer. One of them was John Taylor, which is shown here. To identify Taylor as being one of the men in the group portrait, I examined multiple photographs of men whom I thought were John Taylor. The one on the bottom right with the red star is the one that was in the regimental history. So it's not, you can see he doesn't have his uniform on. So I used Photoshop to layer the images to see if facial features would line up. And you can tell even without doing that that his hairline and his brow is very similar in all the images. Some of my colleagues at the museum really did not like me doing this. They thought it looked ghostly, or even it was creepy of me to do that. But I found it was a great tool to really say, yes, all of these images are the same guy. So I just had to find any way of proving, because when you're looking at photos, we've all seen unidentified Civil War photos. How do you figure out who those people are? This was one of the methods I used. So I now was able to put names on faces as shown here. So James Murray was from Scotland, John Taylor from Scotland, William Lewin from England, Laughlin Madden from Ireland, and he was the only Catholic in the group, so that was interesting, and Edward Murray from Scotland. Once I knew their names, I could really begin my research. I could read in the regimental history, their service records. I could get those records from the National Archives. I checked sources such as immigration and census records. And one thing that was interesting too about what I found out about them, they didn't know each other before they came to Lake County and settled here. So there was no connection prior to this. But knowing their origins helps us understand possible motivations for them to enlist to fight, such as coming from a country where privilege and monarchy ruled. It can also help us to re-envision the identity of the U.S. common soldier and bring recognition to the contributions of immigrant soldiers whose stories are largely untold. I wanted to tell their story from cradle to grave because that's how I am. I've got to know the whole story. So one way to help possibly one place to look at this is to show where they lived when they settled in Lake County, Illinois. So I was as interested in their lives before the war as their lives during military service. This modern-day map of Newport Township in Lake County shows where each man and his family settled between the years 1841 and 1854. To locate information about their lives during this period, I had to spread a wide net, which uncovered nuggets in school attendance ledgers at the University of Wisconsin Parkside Archives, property records at the Lake County Recorder of Deeds, abstracts for county elections at the Lake County Clerk's Office and Illinois State Archives, and manuscript collections at the Dunn Museum and the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, just to name a few places. One of the questions I had was, what led them to become so bonded that they would take a commemorative portrait together? And a crowded portrait at that. They're all very snugly in there together. Part of that answer was their proximity to living to one another. So they would have gotten to know each other after they came to Lake County and settled in. They lived in the same neighborhood. They would have helped on each other's farms. They would have seen each other at community gatherings. And of course, their experiences as immigrants would have bonded them as well. These are not really assumptions either. There were a lot of different documents that I was able to find that pieced them together and tied activities together that they all would have attended. So when war broke out in April 1861, the rush to patriotism in the North united Native and foreign-born Americans in the excitement. Dozens of men throughout Lake County enlisted that first year of the war, but the feeling in Lake County and throughout the nation was that the war would be over quickly. And only a few men were actually needed to fill the quotas in these small communities at that time. So for this reason, Ed Murray and many of his neighbors did not enlist in 1861, though they supported the fight against secessionists. It was in the summer of 1862 when the Union's cause became more desperate with the failure of the Peninsula Campaign, mentioned earlier, in Virginia, followed by President Lincoln's calls for more troops totaling 600,000. That forced communities to meet larger quotas for enlistees. And that's when you really start to see men going around the county and getting signatures on the rolls. And so it was on August 1st, 1862, while Edward Murray was in his harvest field, that John Pollock came recruiting for a company of men that would become Company C of the 96th Illinois. And Murray was 34 years old at this time. So he was well established in the community. He had a family. His farm was growing. He had even served as a township treasurer. So he was really making a place for himself. And the feeling was, because he was older and so well established, that he would be a good leader for the other younger men in the area. So after Murray signed Pollock's list, Pollock walked across the road, just across the dirt road, to Murray's brother-in-law's house, where John Taylor and John's brother James were working as farmhands, and he enlisted them. They were farm laborers there. 2 weeks later, Pollock recruited Billy Lewin, Laughlin Madden, and James Murray. So he's just walking around the neighborhood. And of course, they're all seeing that Ed Murray has already signed on. So that's going to help motivate these other men as well. Most foreign-born men volunteered for the same reasons as their Yankee comrades: patriotism, preservation of the Union, bounties, social advancement, and adventure. However, one thread that resonated with immigrant soldiers was the hope that military service would prove their Americanness. Many of the immigrant men felt the need to prove that they were loyal Americans worthy of citizenship. With Ed Murray's enlistment, his mother, Nancy Riley Murray, was swept up in patriotic fervor and made this American flag that was unfurled at their homestead. The flag was in the family's possession until 2012, when Ed Murray's great-great-granddaughter, shown here, donated the flag to the Dunn Museum. As a museum curator, I put artifacts into historical context and use them to understand, explain, and to present the past. Objects such as the photo tintype and this flag supplement traditional research by providing another aspect of history. For the Murrays, the flag was a tribute to their adopted homeland and their hope for it to remain united. The flag itself gives us clues to Nancy Murray's sentiments when she made it. You'll notice the distinctive choice to stitch 13 stars on the field of blue, rather than 34 stars for the number of states at that time. This symbolically evoked the unity and spirit of the original colonies and the American Revolution. And that may surprise you that Nancy Murray, who's an immigrant, would understand all of that, but that was very much in the public discourse at that time. People were very aware of the American Revolution. They probably even knew people who were children of the Revolution. So this is something she would have understood. The flag itself is a witness to history. Understanding its historical significance became one approach that I used to gain perspective on Ed Murray's story of enlistment and also Lake County's response to the war. The Minto family collection at the Dunn Museum provides insights into the war and the home front in Milburn, Lake County. Now, Milburn was just a few miles from where the 5 men settled, so it's very close to them. Shown here is one of the few remaining copies of the Milburn Literary Society's newsletter called the Milburn Union Casket. Yeah. So, yeah. So here, the term casket actually refers to a treasure box. And that is drawn at the top. If you can look between the 2 American flags, just above and in the middle, there's like a little person holding a box that's open. That's the casket, the treasure casket. The Union casket name also implies it's pro-Union. Susanna Smith was a member of the Literary Society, and her brother George had enlisted with the 96th Illinois. So Susie was a school teacher, and she did a lot to help produce the newsletter, which was all handwritten. So you would, pay a few pennies to get a copy, and they were all handwritten. For a nickel, they would provide the ribbon that you could use to stitch it together. So this also was utilized as a way to keep the men and home together, to keep things unified. So she would take clips from letters that she was getting from her brother and his tent mates and quote them in the newsletter. She did get in trouble about that one time, where the guy said, you should have asked me before you did that, but they ended up having a bit of a romance after that. So it was all good. So this really helped to keep the community and the soldiers connected during the Civil War. And this is her brother George. He served in Company D of the 96. His letters home normally contain a lot of humor. He's very creative with his wording. But the example shown here was written to his sister after the Battle of Chickamauga, and it has a very somber, reflective tone. And I'll quote George. I suppose you have all heard of the fight in which we were engaged at Chickamauga and are all waiting with beating hearts to hear the result. And he talks about the field of strife. When I get to thinking about it, I will choke and tears of gratitude come into my eyes to think that one of us, after feeling such a storm of lead and iron, should have escaped, but such is the chances of every battle. The Minto family collection, which this is a part of, has been digitized, and it is hosted online on the Illinois Digital Archives. So you can read lots and lots of these letters. So with George's introduction to that storm of lead and iron, I will briefly share Ed Murray's experience at Chickamauga. It was a year into their service before the 96th Illinois had its first battle. Yes, they did a lot of training in that year and dug a lot of ditches, built fortifications, guarded wagon trains, the whole bit, but this was their first battle, and what a doozy to start with. And so the 96th Illinois was part of the Army of the Cumberland and Granger's Reserve Corps. It was their single most important engagement of the war. Ed Murray recalled that at Chickamauga, in the charge at Horseshoe Ridge, he was struck between the shoulders near the right side of the spine, which completely paralyzed his lower limbs and rendered him perfectly helpless on the battlefield. Murray remained on the battlefield in enemy hands for 10 days because, of course, the Union did not win this battle, so they did not have control of the field. During that time, he watched many of his comrades die from their wounds. By the 5th day, laying out there on the battlefield, 2 Union surgeons came through the lines to assess the wounded. So they got permission to come in and to see the men. When they reached Murray, they considered him too critical for care. And they left him saying to each other, "There's another poor fellow who could not live long." So he heard them say that. But if not for the kindness of a Southern woman whose home had been in the middle of the battlefield, Murray would have actually starved to death during those 10 days. She came out with chicken broth each day and gave him a cup. And she kept asking him, "Why are you here?" And he says, "Yeah, well, I want to go home too." So because of that, he was able to hang on and eventually was exchanged into Union lines and taken to a hospital. He later recalled that as he lay on the ground at Chickamauga, helpless, he had time to think about his home in Lake County and whether he would ever see it again. So what became of the group of 5 at Chickamauga? Billy Lewin actually tried to assist Murray on the field, but again, Murray was like a dead weight. He couldn't move at all. And when the rebel line approached, Lewin had to run from Murray's side. Lewin was then grazed by a bullet which slightly cut his head and plowed a deep furrow down his back. It disabled him for the remainder of the battle. But he did remain with the regiment. A year later, he became a prisoner of war after the Battle of Resaca, And he was imprisoned at Andersonville and then at Florence prisons until the end of the war. Very emancipated at that point. Murray's brother came from Lake County to the Nashville hospital to take Ed home to convalesce. And Murray did eventually get discharged. That's a whole story. And but the wound was very debilitating, and he only regained partial use of his legs later in his life. Laughlin Madden survived the Battle of Chickamauga without injury, but he was captured while on picket duty days later on Missionary Ridge. He died of scurvy at Andersonville, the notorious Confederate prison, and is buried there. James Murray was not at Chickamauga with his comrades due to being hospitalized for an illness prior to the battle. He was the only one of the 5 men who was with the regiment from start to finish, and he mustered out in June 1865 with the regiment. John Taylor was shot in the wrist in the first charge at Horseshoe Ridge. He walked back to a field hospital and eventually made it to a hospital in Nashville, where his arm was amputated. 6.5 weeks later, he died. The James Taylor collection at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library was really a game changer for me, finding that collection and utilizing it. There's letters from the Taylor family members, including this one regarding the death of John Taylor. This is part of a letter their older sister Isabella wrote to her brother James about John's remains. She said, "Mary tells me you want to bring John's remains home. Do as you think best about it. We all would have liked to have had him buried at home if we could have done it when he died. But it would be a means of renewing our sorrow so much that I shrink from the thought of it." So that very personal wording from her really gives us insight into what many people experienced at this time. John's siblings struggled with his death, and one of the main struggles was there was a regret that his brother James, who had enlisted with him in the 96, had not been able to go to him in the hospital to be at his bedside. And that was because James argued with a doctor that was in charge of giving him a pass. So it's very tragic. This letter provides insight into the events of the war and the trauma that families faced. Victorian-era death customs centered on the family and being with your loved ones' side to care for them and hear their final words. And of course, this did not happen during the Civil War. The war upended those traditions. So John's death in a hospital far away from his family was really impossible for them to come to terms with. The siblings were unable to overcome their emotional and monetary costs to bring him home to be buried in Milburn. So he's buried in the National Cemetery at Nashville. After the war's end and the veterans return home, the men worked to reestablish their lives, but also to honor their fallen comrades. The Dunn Museum recently digitized our collection of ledgers for Civil War Veterans Associations, and those date from 1880 to 1933, also available on Illinois Digital Archives. They're a great resource for seeing who's attending the meetings. You even get to see their signatures and also what projects they spearheaded. One of the big ones was raising flags at schoolhouses. We think today it's ubiquitous. You see an American flag at a schoolhouse. Back then, that wasn't the case. And they also assisted veterans in need. One of their biggest accomplishments was to memorialize their dead comrades by commemorating a monument in the courthouse square in Waukegan on August 29, 1899. The monument, as you can see here on the right, is topped by a bronze statue of a common soldier, a color bearer. The soldier represented all men who had fought and died, native and foreign-born alike. Shown here are members of the Grand Army of the Republic on dedication day standing at the base of the monument. And here's a close-up of the veterans showing a 70-year-old Edward Murray. There he is. Also shown to your left is Henry McIntosh, who's an African-American veteran of the 102nd U.S. Colored Troops. He was born enslaved in Kentucky, and at the start of the war, basically said, I am not going to help the South with this war. And he self-emancipated by making his way north, crossing the Ohio River, getting on the Underground Railroad, making it to Detroit, Michigan, where he enlisted in the 102nd and fought with Sherman. After the war, he ended up coming to Lake Forest in Lake County, Illinois, where his descendants still live. So it was really exciting. This was another one of these moments where I had positively identified someone who wasn't identified in this portrait. And I was 99% sure, and I posted a blog about it, and about a few weeks went by, and I got a phone call, and it was a woman named McIntosh. And she said, that's our great-great-grandfather. So we were very excited to make that connection. So it is possible to do. So solving the mystery of the unidentified men in the photo tintype was just the beginning of my journey that ultimately revealed a unique story of immigrants who settled in Lake County as farmers and why they chose to fight to save the United States at so critical a time in the nation's history. Without the portrait, their lives may never have been connected or linked. And without their stories, the significance of their contribution to the Union's ultimate victory would have been reduced to just names on the regiment's rolls. I'll leave you with one last quote that still resonates. It's from James Corey, who was the editor of the Waukegan Gazette during the Civil War. As the men were marching off to war, Corey wrote, "Let not those who have volunteered be forgotten." Thank you. Okay, 2 questions. I got a thumbs up. Yes, please.
My great-grandfather was a member of the 100th Pennsylvania Volunteers. And they were all Presbyterian, and they were probably Scots-Irish, Scottish. And the 2 major battles they were in were Antietam, and surprisingly, they were at Vicksburg during Gettysburg. I don't know why that happened. I haven't read the whole book, but my great-grandfather's name is on the register.
Wonderful.
And they were recruited from only 2 Pennsylvania counties.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, yes, please.
Thank you for your report. I'm just wondering who Bess Bauer Dunn is.
We get that a lot. Bess Bauer Dunn was actually Lake County's first official historian. She worked at the county courthouse in the probate office at the turn of the century, so from 1899 to 1957. She's the longest county employee on record, and she did all kinds of research into the county's history, took photographs, interviewed the children and grandchildren of settlers, and a lot of her records came to our museum. So we actually have material from her, and she inspires us. So she's not a donor or anything like that. She was a historian that we greatly admire. Okay, thank you very much. Do the pass out.
Did you bring your book?
I did.
Okay, and I will announce it. What's your price?
20.
20.
Yeah. Simpler that way.
Cash?
Yes. Okay, thank you.